Hey everyone, this is Pete, and today I want to talk about a game called Moonring, which is a recent release for PC via Steam at the time of recording. While the name may not be familiar to you unless you've been specifically following the project, if you're a fan of classic role-playing games, you're going to want to pay attention. It was developed by Dene Carter, who is a former programmer and game designer at Bullfrog, later Lionhead, most well remembered for his contributions to the Dungeon Keeper and Fable series. Not only that, Carter has specifically positioned it as an homage to the early Ultima games, and by early, I mean early. We'll get into the details of exactly what that means over the course of this video, but suffice to say, if you're a passionate fan of games like the first two Ultima trilogies, particularly the very earliest entries, and similar titles like SSI's Questron series, you should stop what you're doing right now, download Moonring, and have yourself a thoroughly lovely time. Did I mention it's free? Oh yes, it's completely free. Carter's exact words on the subject are, "Life is hard, COVID sucked, everyone's poor and stressed. I don't need the $300 this would make me, I'd rather take the goodwill. Respect." Anyway, if you'd like to know a little more about Moonring before taking the terrifying and risky plunge into playing a game that doesn't cost any money, keep watching. Moonring is set in the land of Caldera. 500 years ago, Caldera was plunged into endless darkness for reasons that are not revealed at the outset of the game. Sometime later, 5 moons rose in the sky, each bringing their own colour of light to the world and acting as a representation of a mysterious god. As the moons rose, the phenomenon of dreamers revealed itself. Those who dreamed felt an irresistible calling to devote themselves to one of the 5 gods, with supernatural gifts seemingly on offer to the most devoted. While you might think that this would be a setup for a world of perpetual trouble and strife, there is a somewhat uneasy peace across the world, with each of the 5 gods' most devoted followers mostly keeping to themselves, and a figure known as the Archon acting as the 5's mortal representative. Unlike the devotees of the 5 gods, the Archon is dreamless, and thus remains neutral, making them ideally placed to mediate any disputes that might arise. As Moonring begins, your character has reached an age at which most people in Caldera have already begun to dream and feel the call towards one of the 5 gods. You, however, have remained dreamless, and following the death of your father, you feel an irrepressible urge to head out into the world and forge your own destiny. Your father left behind a mysterious stone known as the Serpent's Eye, which is one possible lead you might want to follow up on. It also seems that the current Archon is growing old, and the search for their successor is already underway. As a dreamless individual, you would be ideally placed to fulfill that role, but a long and perilous quest awaits you if that's a path you would like to take. Or you can just wander the world, kicking the crap out of monsters, exploring dungeons, and finding treasure. The choice is yours. While the setup to Moonring might sound quite similar to some of the more elaborate roguelikes out there, such as Tales of Maj'El and Ancient Domains of Mystery, it's worth noting that Moonring is not a roguelike in itself. While its dungeons are randomly generated, and indeed regenerated every time you die using your character's name as a seed, the geography of the overworld is designed by hand, and you don't have to start the game all over again every time you make a mistake. The game instead features a fairly generous autosave system, whereby death simply sends you back to the last checkpoint. To minimise save scumming and abuse, however, you can't save the game manually, except when you quit out to the main menu. The outset of the game gives you a good introduction to what to expect from the experience as a whole. You have the opportunity to engage in conversation and ask about a variety of subjects. You're given a clue as to something you might want to investigate, and you're presented with a dungeon to clear, with something interesting awaiting you at its conclusion. Once you're through this initial section of the game, pretty much the whole world is open to you. The opening sequence gives you a vague suggestion as to where it might be worth going next, and it's a good idea to follow this, but you have no obligation to. Indeed, throughout the entire game, you'll never feel like there is only one specific thing that you have to go and do. There are always plenty of options to explore. In the earliest role-playing games, such as the aforementioned Ultima and Questron, you'd be expected to keep your own notes on rumours and other information you picked up along the way, such as important locations. Without doing so, you'd have to rely on simply wandering aimlessly and stumbling across things as you went. Here's one area where Moonring differs quite noticeably from its spiritual predecessors. Rather than slavishly recreating that old school experience, which would be mostly unpalatable to a lot of modern gamers, and indeed to those veterans who thought they'd left the days of pen and paper behind, Moonring features a variety of modern conveniences designed to keep the game as a whole feeling authentic, but without requiring too much additional effort on the part of the player beyond simply, playing the game. To that end, Moonring features a comprehensive automatic note-taking system, whereby anything vaguely important that anyone has said to you is recorded in your character's journal, and this can then be explored by topic, location, or your most recent interactions with characters. It's a good balance between the checklist approach of a modern quest log and the traditional pen and paper approach. It encourages you to explore and discover things at your own pace, without leaving you at risk of forgetting critical information. That's not the only area where Moonring subtly modernises things without compromising the classic role-playing game feel. The actual way you discover that information features some modern conveniences too. Most notably the way that important keywords you might want to ask about are highlighted in NPC dialogue, and after you've heard them once, they continue to pop up and float around your character's head as the conversation continues until you've asked about all of them. There's also an on-screen list of all the keywords you've already asked about, and an autofill facility that means you don't have to type out the full word in order to ask about it. Don't get too complacent though. There are parts of the game where you'll be required to ask NPCs about topics that they don't initially bring up, meaning the keywords don't appear in the cloud around your character's head or the autofill feature. You still don't need to write things down yourself though, because the fact you need to ask someone about a specific keyword will be recorded somewhere in the game's automatic notes. All in all, it's a good balance between the old school approach and the conveniences of modern games. It allows you to feel like you're discovering and deducing things for yourself, and completely eliminates the hand-holding that veteran gamers so often criticise in recent releases. In Carter's words, "The days I spent playing early 1980s games like Lord British's Ultima series and early roguelikes were spent in joyful exploration and discovery, venturing into the dark unknown, a co-author of the experience, filling in the gaps left by the primitive art with my imagination. For those of you who did the same, I hope Moonring recaptures some of the spirit of those days for you. For those who did not, I hope that the more modern conveniences you find in this game allow you to catch a glimpse of what we did 40 years ago. 40 years ago, fucking hell. Another couple of areas where Moonring strikes a good balance between the peculiarities of early 80s role-playing games and modern conveniences is in the combat and progression systems. For those unfamiliar, many early RPGs completely lacked what we now think of as a conventional experience and levels-based progression system, each adopting their own methods of allowing your character to grow in power. For example, the first Ultima allows you to gain vast amounts of hit points by venturing into dungeons and defeating monsters. Upon returning to the surface, you automatically gain hit points up to a maximum of 9,999 based on the number of monsters you've defeated and how powerful they were. You can also increase your statistics by visiting various out-of-the-way signposts scattered around the world. An important part of completing Ultima 1 involves making repeated pilgrimages to these signposts in succession to buff up all your stats to suitably powerful levels. SSI's Questron, meanwhile, allows you to gain hit points by donating to cathedrals around the map and purchasing holy water items, essentially repeatedly healing yourself until you had as many hit points as you want. Stat progression, meanwhile, comes through a combination of minigames and giving money or items to various characters around the game world. In both cases, there is a fair amount of grinding involved, but not for experience. Instead, money is power, as it affords you access to better offensive and defensive equipment. A huge part of becoming fighting fit in Questron, Ultima and other games that followed a similar mould is in suitably equipping yourself. With better armour, you can survive for longer before needing to heal, and with better weapons, you can defeat monsters more quickly, which leads to greater rewards over time. Moonring also lacks a conventional experience and level system, and maintains its spiritual predecessor's focus on the importance of good equipment. Your character is woefully weak at the start of the game, to a borderline maddening degree at times, and thus an important first step in your overall adventure is gathering together enough money to be able to afford a decent weapon and some protective gear if you don't want to be at risk of dying to literally anything that attacks you. At this point in the middle of the video, I will slip in the one and only thing that I genuinely dislike about Moonring, the somewhat cringy, meme-filled death messages that rather undermine the genuinely excellent sense of atmosphere that the writing elsewhere in the game manages to create. There are at least a decent variety of them. This is good, because you'll be dying a lot in the early game. But I can't pretend I didn't wince the first time I saw "I can have Death Burger" pop up on screen after carking it. I guess that's as good as an incentive as any to not die. I think the main reason I dislike them is that they feel anachronistic, for want of a better word. While memes are very much a 21st century internet thing, and Moonring is a game that released in 2023, the game otherwise works so hard at trying to create an experience that feels authentically 80s with modern conveniences that they feel completely out of place and they suck. But that's the last I'll say on the matter, probably. Anyway, combat itself in Moonring is resolved similarly to the games that inspired it, in that it's relatively simple for the most part. Walk into an enemy and you'll try to hit them, and if you're next to an enemy, they'll try to hit you. The game is turn-based though, so you can take your time to consider your situation if things look like they might be getting a bit sticky. Moonring's big innovation compared to its precursors is the addition of a statistic known as poise. This is a bar separate from your character's main hit point bar, initially providing you an additional 200 points on top of your 400 starting hit points. When you take damage, it comes off your poise first. It's only when your poise is broken by reducing it to 0 that you start to take damage to your hit points. But crucially, poise regenerates. Avoid taking damage for a few turns and you'll start to get poise back with each passing turn, accompanied by a satisfying synthesized noise that actually provides some quite helpful audible feedback, as well as sounding delightfully old school. This changes up the dynamic of combat fairly radically, in that it makes movement and positioning a lot more important than in earlier games of this type. It's not uncommon for battles to rage across a wide area, with you ducking and diving out of the way to regenerate poise, between getting in solid hits on your opponents. You'll also have to bear in mind the position of other enemies while doing this. If, while darting out of the way of an opponent's attacks, you inadvertently stumble into another gathering of hostiles, you can potentially find yourself in a world of trouble. So it's important to think carefully before any tactical retreats. Like Ultima and Questron, you don't gain experience from fighting opponents. Some will drop money, while others will drop tradable items, consumables or equipment that can be sold. So the main contribution of combat to your overall character progression in Moonring is helping you to raise funds. The other part of progression in Moonring comes through pleasing the 5 gods in various ways to acquire devotion. This is accomplished by completing various tasks for each of them, including visiting the town that is the spiritual home of that god and their devoted followers, plus performing various thematically appropriate actions a sufficient number of times. You can also acquire devotion through a particular item, which can be applied to any one of the 5 gods you please. Each god relates to a particular statistic, and for each point of devotion you acquire for a particular god, the statistic in question raises by 5 points. Not only that, but the devotion you accumulate for a particular god can be spent on various gifts, which mostly take the form of special actions that can be performed in exchange for spiritual energy. The costs for these actions are reduced when the moon that corresponds to the god in question is in ascendance, and you're also able to choose to dedicate yourself to one of the 5 gods specifically for additional bonuses and reduced casting costs for their gifts, but it also places a restriction on you. Break the rule imposed on you by the god in question and you'll find yourself cursed by them, which can cause you problems. You can also end up cursed if you choose to change the god that you've dedicated yourself to, although it's also worth noting that one of the god's lists of tasks that helps you to progress is to be cursed by all the others. In theory, it's possible to max out your character by gaining enough devotion to gain all the god's gifts and increase your statistics accordingly, but particularly in the early part of the game, you'll find yourself building your character somewhat around your preferred playstyle. The god's list of tasks to prove your devotion provide a good incentive to explore the game world and its systems, so if you don't quite feel up to tackling any of the game's more large-scale quests, these are worth pursuing purely to improve your character. It's Moonring's equivalent of Ultima's signpost pilgrimages, only with a tad more mechanical variety and depth. There are a number of other interesting things to Moonring's mechanics that make it clear that it's a modern game. Probably the most notable is its clever and varied use of status effects. These not only include the kind you'd expect to see in a role-playing game, such as being poisoned or bleeding, but also more unusual ones, such as being wet, which helps you to resist fire damage and catching on fire, but also puts you at greater risk of being infected with rot. And it's sometimes desirable to seek out negative status effects depending on how you've built your character. Some of the god's gifts allow you to either consume status effects to heal damage to yourself, or even to transfer your status effects to enemies near you. One effect you'll likely run into quite frequently is madness. As you explore the land of Caldera, a strange amber mist often appears, and being caught within this without a powered lamp puts you at risk of being temporarily afflicted with madness. When this happens, the game's colours become psychedelic, your character regularly spews nonsense, you're at greater risk of being stunned, which in Moonring is implemented more like a confusion effect, making your movements and actions unpredictable, and you even hallucinate, often seeing monsters as things they are not, or even seeing monsters where there are none. It's an interesting effect to have to deal with. It can be dangerous, but it's not the sort of thing that makes you immediately want to give up and reload, and it's one of many mechanical aspects of the game that helps to add to the overall lore of the world. There's a lot to discover in Moonring, and I suspect, at the time of recording, I've barely scratched the surface. But hopefully you can already see that this isn't a game that is paying simple lip service to the classic role-playing games of yore. This is a game that is a genuinely loving homage to them, but which doesn't get bogged down in trying to be authentic to the point of frustration. Instead, it sensibly takes the most interesting, intriguing and oft-forgotten elements of classic games and combines them with a variety of subtly implemented modern conveniences, making for a game that has an altogether unique feel. If you've never played a classic Ultima game or any of its numerous imitators, Moonring is an excellent means of introducing yourself to this very distinctive style of role-playing game. And for those who grew up with this kind of game, it's a nice reminder of the good old days, without a lot of the frustrations that lurk just out of sight of nostalgia's rose-tinted spectacles. While today considered unconventional and unusual, during the earliest days of the genre, this is just how things were, and it's a lot of fun to go back, whether you're rediscovering this way of playing or encountering it for the first time. Also, let's not forget it's free. So if you have the slightest interest in this sort of thing, you have zero excuse not to try it for yourself. And on that note, it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.